Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Julia. I was an admission officer at Haverford College, an outside reader for Emory University, and I currently work at Milton Academy, an independent boarding and day school outside of Boston, Massachusetts.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy has a bachelor's degree from the University of Georgia and a master's degree from North Carolina State University. She works in private practice in Raleigh as a mental health therapist. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. Good morning, friends. I'm in a very good mood about one thing and a little salty about something else. All right, let's talk about what I'm in a good mood about. I'm always talking about my brother, Norm, my best friend who's been here from Denver 4 times in the last 12 months. Now my sister's coming for the first time in 10 years from Southern Ontario, and she's actually surprising my mom on Valentine's Day and saying she's treating her to airline tickets, so I'll get to see my 85-year-old mom and my sister. My mom hasn't been here since 2017, Joy's high school graduation. We've gone there a lot, and that's only because my dad's health was failing the last 5 years, and she was his caretaker. And I'm super pumped. So from the 9th to the 13th of March, I'll be with my sister and my mom. And Karis is surprising both of them by coming back and flying in from Durham. All right, what am I a little salty about? Well, guess what? My 6 months are up, and it's time for me to check in and give you guys a weight update. And I only lost 1 pound for the entire month. So I don't know if my body's just adjusted to what I was doing, but I need to mix it up. I am down 25 pounds, and I've lost weight every month, but I've been losing less and less every month, and I don't have any margin for error anymore. And I've still got 55 to go, and 1 pound a month is not cutting it. That would literally take me 55 months to reach my goal, so that's just not going to work. I am going to get these 80 pounds off. I am 100% convinced of that. 25 down, 55 to go. And instead of just focus on that big 55 number, which isn't as big as 80, but it's still a big number, I'm going to break it down, and I'm only going to focus on 5 pounds this month. And I'm going to pick up my exercise. And if I don't lose 5 by March 6th on my next weigh-in, I'll be reaching out to you guys for some ideas, but I promise you I'm going to lose these 80 pounds, and I'll end our podcast with an axiom that I'm going to keep emblazoned on my mind. All right, for today's episode. Now, part of me is getting tired of talking about these elite schools because they get so much press coverage, but you asked for it many times over. So Gio and I will be discussing Dartmouth's decision to be the first Ivy school to announce a return to test mandatory admissions. It's a 1-hour discussion. Part 1, 30 minutes today and 30 minutes next week. We have a brand new interview, and it's with Andy Borst, the VP of Enrollment at the University of Georgia. And we'll be actually talking about a few things with Andy over the next 3 weeks. But for this week, we'll be focusing on how is AI changing how admission offices function. Andy will be separating facts from myth. All right, let's dive right in with my conversation with Julia on Dartmouth's decision to go test optional. Hi, Julia.
Hi, Mark.
Well, Julia and I had to come on here because my phone has just absolutely erupted. So is my email with requests from listeners to talk about Dartmouth's decision. One of them really cracked me up. It was a cryptic email that said, I'm hoping you guys are going to talk about a certain school that starts with the letter D. And it was like Tuesday night and saying, I'm hoping it will happen on Thursday. So production calendar doesn't work that fast. We got to get stuff to the sound engineer, at least 48 hours in advance. Then we got to record it. But we're here to talk about the decision. And everybody knows they're the first Ivy League school to return to test mandatory admissions. And so Julie and I just have a little 4-point outline we're going to go through today. So the first question is, does Dartmouth's decision mean a lot of schools are about to reject test optional admissions and return to test mandatory admissions? What are your thoughts on that, Julia?
I don't think by and large that this is going to inspire other schools to do it. And in fact, the proof is in the pudding already. We've seen other Ivy League schools almost immediately commit to remaining test optional, or we've already had a couple schools who have made the commitment for a few years out.
You want to mention those names, Julia, so that people, if they're not following as closely as you and I do, they know what you're talking about?
Yes. Let me get my little list here so I know I'm not making any. But Princeton, for example, is remaining test optional. Harvard. You've got Cornell making a commitment a few years out, and then Johns Hopkins also will remain test optional. Stanford will remain test optional, and then also the University of California system will remain score free. So those are, I hate that I'm always talking about, well, hate's a strong word, but maybe this is true, that I'm always talking about these uber selective places on the podcast.
But in this case, it makes sense because these are the ones that have the stature in the marketplace that they could do it if they chose to do it. There may be some others that may want to do it, but they just would feel like there's no way we're going to get slammed. How can we justify school XYZ is not doing it? And we don't want to take the decrease in applications. The other school you never mentioned was Columbia.
Yes.
They also came out with a really strong commitment. They said they will be test optional permanently, indefinitely. So Columbia went even further than Harvard, who said that they will be test optional until college class of 2030. And then they will reevaluate their decision. And some of those statements that you've mentioned have come out post the Dartmouth announcement.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Princeton was definitely post that announcement. Wasn't Wisconsin? If my memory serves me correct. Was it Wisconsin?
Yes, I think you're right. Yes.
Friends, Julie and I recorded this on the morning of Saturday, February 9th. And just after we recorded this, Cornell and Vanderbilt reaffirmed their commitment to test optional admissions. Now, Cornell's extension is a short-term one, only for next year, and they're going to reevaluate it again. Vanderbilt committed to being test optional for 3 more years. Vanderbilt's Dean of Admission and Financial Aid, Doug Christensen, is quoted in an Inside Higher Ed article that ran on February 9th about extending their policy rather than making it permanent will allow the university to conduct its own research and make an informed decision with 3 years more of data. Christensen added that removing the testing requirement has led to a boost in all forms of diversity in Vanderbilt's applicant pool. And he believed transcripts were likely a more important indicator of student success than test scores. So the exact opposite of what Dartmouth is saying. So these are like really, really recent, hot off the press since Dartmouth. So we are not of the impression that this is something that is going to be widespread. And that's a lot of the questions that I was getting from listeners. Is this a return to test mandatory admissions? In some cases, some people were celebrating it, usually if their kid is a really high tester, so it was a mix in terms of how this was received. Let's speculate a little bit, Julia. Let's put our cap on and say, I think it would be naive to say they're the only school that will do this. I mean, really, we have a very, very short list right now. So for those of you who are not following this closely, we have Georgetown, MIT, Purdue, and Dartmouth. And then you have some state systems where it's being done above the school level. And in many cases, I've talked to leaders at those schools and they don't like it. And they've said they can't tell us how to use it. They can just tell us that we have to use it. Some of those schools would be the state of Florida, which never, ever was test optional, even in the pandemic, even when it was couldn't get to the test. And some of that's because the Bright Future Scholarship is tied into test scores. And so that's a pillar of their whole merit-based scholarship system. And then Georgia can't make up their mind. They've been all over the place, from going test optional year one to then next year they said they were not, and then they changed midway, because of the backlash. And then more recently, they have said they're not test optional for Georgia, Georgia Tech, and Georgia College, the three most selective public schools within the 26 schools in the USG system. So Georgia can't make up its mind. But those, I mention them only because it is going to be test mandatory if you're applying to those Florida schools, and then Tennessee being the other public state to also come in and require them. But once again, Georgia, has a Hope Scholarship, and there's a Zell Miller component that has a test score component to it. So those state systems, and Tennessee also has a Hope Scholarship, by the way, as well, and those individual schools. That's a really small number.
Right.
So let's talk about some of the schools that we're watching. And I will say this, I did a deep 45-minute episode on this, wasn't that long ago. I remember I recorded it when I was in Raleigh. So it was a few months ago, where I went through the schools and literally looked at what their policy said, and I read it on the air. But I know we get new listeners all the time. Not everybody hears every episode. And even those who hear every episode could always use a refresher. So this was episode 382. If you want to go back and hear me read various policies from selective universities in what was a long and lengthy episode on this topic. Let's talk about some of the schools, Julia, that you and I have our eye on that potentially could return to test mandatory admissions. Who's on your list?
I think there's sort of two categories, and then I could probably name some names, but there probably are some schools that are not uber selective. Maybe they admit over 60% of their applicants who would like to have an edge in US news or rankings or what have you. And they might be able to, even if their research doesn't support this, that test scores are helpful in making decisions, that they might feel they might have the license now and the freedom to be able to have the school go back to requiring standardized tests, being able to cite, hey, well, Dartmouth did it, so this can't be a terrible marketing idea, or this can't be a terrible idea. I think it's also important to remember that a lot of faculty at universities and colleges support testing, which makes me really sad. But in the Dartmouth case, which we'll get more into, is that there's research that backs it up, that this is in the best mission of this. It's in the mission of the school to actually continue or to have the testing requirement. And so there might also be, in the other category for me, would be the schools where that is, the research is coming up for them, like it is for Dartmouth, like it did for MIT. And that could be very based on your population. So it's also, there's still a lot of, direct admits or programs at universities that do require standardized testing, because research does show that students are not successful. I'm thinking of like accelerated med programs, BA or BSMDs. Some schools will still say for engineering, you might need to provide test scores. So there is some
homeschool. Some students still required for homeschool students too.
Yes. Yep. Exactly. So there's still some schools that have done enough, enough data collection that it is a priority for them, or it makes sense for them to consider testing. I also have some, schools that I know love testing. And so I wonder if this kind of, even if they're research maybe doesn't support it, that this might be, like they're not going to now lose out applicants that they might have shared with some other schools that are now asking for tests. So I don't know. It's gone through a lot of changes for me in the last few years. I do think Caltech has done really good work at their own research, but I wonder if some other schools, like a Caltech, so Polytechnic or technical institutes, might go back to just like an MIT, to requiring test scores. But besides other, name, I don't really know of any other names that I'm thinking of.
So I'll tell you a few that I'm watching closely. Definitely Yale, even just because of the fact that Jeremy Quinlan has publicly said that test scores are a better predictor of grades than grades are. You can go back and listen to it as a conversation with Lee Coffin and Jeremy Quinlan on Lee Coffin's The Beat podcast, and they've been saying that for a long time in conversations. They have been making that statement, and even if you look at the language that they had on their website, even when they were test optional, they still said on there that they find test scores to be helpful, and we encourage you to send your scores and let us decide. So on one hand, I think that would they buck Harvard and Princeton and Stanford and be the only one of those four big schools to go in that direction? They have a number of new diversity initiatives in play. They have said that a long-term decision will be coming out this spring. I also, when I did that last podcast, I said keep an eye on two groups of schools, ones that are highly selective,
Mm-hmm.
because I feel they have the position where they could get away with it. Ones that did not go test optional until the pandemic, so they previously were test mandatory, and ones that still have not announced their decision yet for the junior class, because that there's massive internal debate if they have not made a decision yet, and there's strong voices on both sides. I would add a fourth category to that. I should have said this before, I just didn't think of it at the time. Schools where the faculty has a lot of say in how things are done.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Schools,
especially some larger, maybe some public or large research institutions that I could see that.
And keep an eye on the Southern flagship schools. I mean, you already have Florida, Georgia, and Tennessee. So I'm just watching that group very. And also, engineering school faculty tend to love test scores. So it won't surprise me if a selective school that has a specific school of engineering that applicants apply directly into requires it for that college within the university. Brown is another one that's on my radar just because the president was quoted recently in an article. I should have the exact quote, but in essence, it said, standardized testing is a far better predictor than grades. Now, I know Logan Powell probably was like, don't say that. It's over their admission office. But the president was out there making that statement and used very strong language. It wasn't even like incrementally better, like significantly better. So when you have a president out making a statement like that, and you check those other boxes that I said, meaning you didn't go test optional until the pandemic, you still haven't really come forward with a long-term policy, you're on my radar. When you and I interviewed Heath Einstein, he was said a policy will be coming shortly, but then he also said, I can't imagine that we would go back to requiring test scores. He quoted data on
Right.
15% of our students come from California, and people that take the test in California has dropped precipitously, with the state schools going score-free, test blind, use your word.
Right.
And so he would be, he didn't use the word shocked, but all his language indicated it would be very, very surprising. Sometimes these people tip their hand when you talk to them about where they see things are going.
Yeah.
Of course, sometimes faculty can come overrule, but, we're
Right.
just trying to read the tea leaves as to where they're at right now, which is a ever-evolving situation.
Right. And certainly there's, not every college does this, but a lot will sort of at the end of a cycle say how many admitted students submitted test scores. And I would also imagine, like, in that point, if it's a vast majority, then that might be another indicator too, as well.
Yeah. And by the way, I just want to be clear. I am not making a prediction that
Yeah.
Yale, Brown will return to test mandatory admissions. We're just saying these are some schools that we're watching closely. And I'll speak for myself. The two I mentioned are ones that would not be surprising to me.
Sure.
If they were. Yale's the hardest one for me because would they really go against Harvard, Princeton, and Stanford? I don't know. But they've always been so very outspoken. In fact, the reason why this decision from Dartmouth didn't surprise me, of course, Julie and I interviewed Lee Coffin. Many of you heard that. He made a big announcement there that they were going to test recommended.
Right.
And then he went one step further on his own podcast in his conversation with Jeremy Quinlan, where they both said that its test scores are a better predictor than grades. And so, I mean, you can kind of read the tea leaves. But if you force me to guess, I'm going to predict that Brown and Yale will join Columbia and Cornell and Princeton and Harvard and reaffirm their test optional policy for at least one more year. But look to see if they do that, do they make a 1-year commitment or a multi-year commitment? So a little bit of an indication of how much of a debate is happening inside the office. Those are my thoughts on that. Anything else on that topic to mention? You think we covered it, Julia? Topic number one.
I just think it's important that it is an individual choice. It is not necessarily like a trend. And so I just really like to hammer that point home, because I don't want people to certainly, like, twice in my life has the admissions world like permeated like the civilian life of my family and friends, right? And this was the second time, the first being Varsity Blues.
Sure.
And so Dartmouth did go to great lengths to really explain the research behind why they are going to require tests. And so I do think that all these schools are really looking at their own research, looking at what is a better predictor. And I also think we have to think about the contextual pieces here. Dartmouth is it is the most, if you will, sort of rural Ivy League school. So unlike a Columbia or a Stanford that are located in urban centers, which might not have as much of a issue attracting or enrolling BIPOC students, low income students, first generation college students. So, and maybe, I'm also thinking of my independent school where those students, my first gen students or my rural students or my low income or BIPOC students, I think it discourages them. But I hope what people can see with Dartmouth is that they did determine that they were losing out on, that it could have been, they lost out on some applicants that they would have loved to have enrolled because of that missing data point. So just remembering that everything is contextual, and that maybe a student from rural areas not going to need, just like, it's been stated, a 1400 can still be really, really, I mean, I think it's really impressive anyways, but really, really impressive, even if a pool has, 1550 or above as the average of the SAT. So just, I really hope colleges, do their research and make sure that the research backs up sort of what their testing policies are. And the last thing I'll say is that what especially sort of makes me nervous about this is that we've got two really interesting things going on. We do have a ton of grade inflation that has not recovered after the pandemic. So I understand that is really flavoring research. The other thing that makes me really concerned too is that this decision, or the decisions to go back to being a test required at any college, is coinciding with the fact that we no longer have race conscious admissions, right? And I just think that that's a really and maybe that does flavor the research in a good way. And maybe it's also something that we don't know what the confluence of the two of those things might produce.
Yeah. And, Penn is another school who is on my radar. It'd be a little surprising to me because they're rivals with Princeton. Would they buck what Princeton did, and Columbia and Harvard? I would be a little surprised if they went up there like that. But they do sort of check the other boxes of haven't come out with their policy yet. Test scores have played a role in the past, and we're only went test optional and were forced to go when the pandemic. So I'll say they're a little bit on my radar. I think they'd be the most surprising to me of the ones I mentioned, but nevertheless, not super surprising. So that's kind of it for the whole country. Chicago has reaffirmed their position.
I'm coming from a private school background where I think, I hate to say it, but I do think, and like shout out to Rice. Zach Augie, thank you so much for being such a great rep. Is that, he's really effusive saying, like, I know you're coming from private school. We're not expecting test scores from you, even though we expect them to be high if you're coming from a private school. But I do think, I have heard from some colleges that, not that they're disappointed or a student's at a disadvantage, but there's an expectation a little bit that our students would be producing test scores.
And you have two things. You have a private school with a
Right.
lot of wealth and high education and privilege. And then you also have a large school group
Yes,
too.
that's
You
also
have
true. Yeah,
yeah.
which
So we
might
talked
help.
about that with Andy Strickler, right? Schools can be a lot more picky when they're trying to have a diversity of schools. And then all of a sudden one school presents them with a boatload of applicants. They can be very, very picky there.
Right.
So that double whammy can make it a little sometimes harder for your kids in certain instances. Of course, they have a lot of advantages too that can counteract that. But
Totally.
yeah.
Which is also another point of all of this, by the way, which is that there's other, just because there's an absence of test scores does not necessarily equalize anything, right? There are still ways that, especially my students, they produce maybe better essays, they have richer teacher recs. So there's other data points in the file that are already added that allow other students to be at an advantage. So
extracurriculars that are incredibly well defined over 18 years. Yeah.
Right. So it's not, so as much as I love not having standardized tests, I do also need to acknowledge, which is again a point that Dartmouth made, that there's other data points in the file that are also inherently inequitable.
Mm-hmm. And I do think it's important that we sort of follow up one thing you said. A lot of times people will say, my kid is coming from X school and it is a privileged school. A lot of times it's an independent school or it's an affluent suburb. And I've had a number of people say this to me. I don't believe that test scores are optional for me.
Right.
And my response to that is very nuanced.
Yes.
Because there are schools that it is optional for you. And Rice is an example of the,
Mm-hmm.
And there are other instances where a school may know, yeah, this person is at an independent school. It's really hard for me to believe there was no possible way they could take the test. However, that still doesn't mean it's in your best interest to submit non-competitive scores.
Right. And
that's still
probably
your better chance. That's
yes,
still your better path.
This is my most, I would say I have this conversation with every family that I've got on my docket. It's real because it's confusing and there's lots of rumors out there. And then we also, sometimes there's data to back that up. So yeah, it's really tricky.
Well, this is what I want to say and really, really, really be emphatic about it. The Dartmouth decision didn't change anything from the perspective of what I do with my students and families. And this is what I mean. It has always been in your best interest to submit high scores, even for test optional schools. I've had many a test optional school tell me we like test scores. We just believe that we can admit a student without them. We have enough data to assess a student, and we would be missing out on people that could make our community stronger if we never had that flexibility. Doesn't mean we don't like test scores because we're test optional. So it's always been in your personal best interest to submit high test scores. Second thing, it has always been your second best option not to submit low scores. The worst option has always been to submit non-competitive scores. And one of the reasons why I feel so passionately about this, and I know Julia can say the same thing, I have students that I have worked with that are highly resourced, coming from private schools, even in overrepresented demographics, Caucasian, Asian. Julie and I have seen it for females and males that did not submit test scores and are in some of the most selective schools in the country, including the Ivy League.
Absolutely.
So we know for a fact that it's not, oh, you absolutely have to have scores from X school, because we've seen exceptions to that. So And so the worst thing is always to submit non-competitive scores. And yeah, you can be dead on arrival for that. Now, the tricky part is, what is a good enough score for each school? And we can't cover that here. But the point is, really, the Dartmouth announcement didn't change anything as far as that same basic principle. You have good scores, submit them. You have bad scores, don't submit them. And the worst thing is to submit bad scores. So that's status quo. That does not mean there are not some things percolating under the surface, which we'll get more into when we look at Dartmouth's research. So the next question Julie and I want to tackle is, does Dartmouth's decision mean schools who say they are test optional are really not test optional? Any thoughts on that, Julia?
Well, I think that was a really good summary that you just gave, Mark, and I you gave good hints as to schools that we doubt the most as to what that behavior might look like. But I like to think at the end of the day that that a school really does. If they are test optional, they are truly test optional. And you're right. I have seen that by and large. The majority of my students will take 2 tests probably, if not more. I wish they would just stop at 2, but and I would say the majority of my students are still scoring in the 97th to 99th percentile. And my students who are, and I'm talking the demographic you had just mentioned, I'm talking.
Let me stop you for a second, Julia, because not everybody might know. Julia works at a highly competitive, highly selective school where probably, I don't know, 30 to 40% of the kids have 1,500 plus SATs, probably. You think that's a fair estimate?
Yeah, or maybe even a little less, actually. So,
really? Okay.
Yes, and in that case, that is why, if my student falls into the demographic of which the average student who's of the same demographic at my school is scoring in that, then I'm not going to tell a student to submit it's painful, but a 15-20 if they're part of that demographic. But then I also have lots of great students who aren't part of that demographic, and they feel discouraged that they don't have a 1550 or above, but maybe a 1400 is really strong. They're coming from their first gen student or prior to Milton. Milton is not going to catch them up to the our wealthy, highly educated parents, students. 4 years is not going to change that at Milton. So there's nuance here, but I would say while the majority of my students do take a test and still score very highly, it is not the majority that are reporting their scores to colleges.
Friends, this completes the first half. Hope you'll join us next week for the final part.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, this is a one-part interview with Andy Borst on how colleges use AI in college admissions, separating truth from fiction. And Andy starts out by sharing his background. Then Andy talks about an article that ran in Inside Higher Ed on AI and college admissions entitled, Admission Offices Turn to AI for Application Review, that Andy spoke out vociferously about on social media. So Andy recounts what the article says and why he disagreed with the content. And he talks about very specific ways he feels AI can be used more effectively, but he says no one is doing this yet. And he talks about the risks involved in using AI detectors to screen essays. And he talks about how he feels AI can be effectively used by students. I share a story from this year about my experience with an AI essay detector. Andy and I talk about the use of AI when it comes to administrative efficiency. Andy tells us what linear and logistical regression is and how it differs from AI. Andy discusses predictive modeling. Andy talks about one aspect of AI that he's excited about. And he explains why a 3.98 GPA is absolutely meaningless. And he made me laugh so hard I couldn't stop. And he talks about colleges doing more testing to see how a GPA in high school projects a GPA in college. And finally, Andy talks about the FAFSA delays and how the University of Georgia is handling it. Listen and enjoy. Friends, I'm here with Andy Borst, the VP of Enrollment from the University of Georgia. Welcome to the Your College Bound Kid podcast, Andy.
Thanks, Mark. I'm happy to be here.
Well, listeners, I'm going to share something that I'm not just saying this because Andy's here. It's a consensus of a number of our co-hosts on the podcast. We believe that you're one of the 5 to 10 key leaders in the admission profession. So, I met at the NACAC conference in Houston in 2022, and you did a presentation there with Purdue in Minnesota. Do you remember that?
I do remember that. We were talking about admission to program. That was interesting.
Yeah, it was great. And Mitch Warren from Purdue been on since then. And you said you'd come on. I talked to you afterward, and you're a man of your word.
I did. This is a promise fulfilled.
Awesome. So why don't you give a little bit of your bio? Sure. Of course, I'm pretty thrilled to have you about an hour away from me now, but you were at Illinois last time when I met you.
I was. So I am the Vice Provost for Enrollment Management at the University of Georgia. I've been in the South for all of 6 months. I'm still learning the culture and the fantastic weather that we have here. Prior to my current role, I was the Director of Undergraduate Admissions at the University of Illinois. I was there for about 7 years, and I was in the state of Illinois for the last 15. I'm a Midwesterner, born, educated on all the things. And my exposure to the South was looking out the window at the Atlanta airport. So I am knee deep in culture right now.
Awesome. Well, Andy's going to address 2 different topics with us, both of which I'm really excited about. And first topic is going to be the hot one, AI, how it's impacting admission offices. And I was glad he actually picked this. I asked all our thought leaders, what's a topic that's kind of been percolating on your mind a little lately? And if they mention something that we haven't had recently, then we go for it. And so he suggested this. And Andy, I saw you got in a little bit of I don't want to say Twitter battle, but you spoke out pretty vociferously on Twitter after an Inside Higher Ed article ran that was entitled "Admission Offices Turning to AI for Application Review." And you just responded with saying, quote, "There is 0% chance admission officers are using AI to read files in the way this internet survey and article implies." So probably most of our listeners haven't read the article, but can you summarize the article and sort of indicate what you disagreed with in the article?
Sure. Before I get into what I didn't like about the article, I do want to say that I'm a big fan of the author of the Inside Higher Ed author. I think he's doing really great work on the current FAFSA debacle that we find ourselves in. I think he's doing other great things. Sometimes we just have an off day of work, and I think that the AI article was probably an off day for him. He was kind enough to reach out to me after I made my Twitter thread about my disagreements that admissions offices are using AI in the way that is portrayed in the article. The article in Inside Higher Ed is parroting a press release from an internet survey company that's talking about that they reached out to individuals that work at private high schools and folks that work at higher ed who felt like they had a good understanding of their admissions process, and then indicated that they are using artificial intelligence as a part of their admissions, part of their regular admissions process. And I read this and I thought, wow, really? Are many institutions using AI? This doesn't sound right, because directors of admissions talk all the time, especially those who are trying to get through 50,000 applications on a yearly basis, to try and do it in a more efficient way, a more effective way. And no one was talking about using AI in the way that this article said. So as I was reading this article, I started to parcel out that the things that the survey and that the article were identifying as artificial intelligence was not the case at institutions. So if you were to say that institutions are using artificial intelligence to rank students, to sort students by test score or by GPA, and then make decisions by that, in some ways you could say that that's artificial intelligence. But if that's true, that that is artificial intelligence, then institutions have been doing it for over 100 years using something called linear regression. The simplest explanation that I can give for that is the University of Iowa has the Iowa Regents formula that looks at test score, GPA, and number of AP courses taken, and then makes an admissions decision either to admit or to not admit based off of those metrics. That's not artificial intelligence. That's just statistics. And so I wanted to highlight that there's a lot of emotional energy put into writing essays, identifying what students are going to participate in for their extracurricular activities or what classes that they're going to take. Students put a lot of time, energy, thought into what's going into those things. And the article implies that those things just don't matter. It runs through a filter, and that admissions officers at selective institutions just aren't even looking at that information. And nothing could be further from the truth. There are potential ways to use AI in the future, which I'm happy to talk about too, but that's just not happening at large selective institutions or small, highly selective private institutions. The way in which I think that AI can be used in the future is that there is a lot of information out there about students from transcripts. And as you can imagine, students coming from multiple high schools, so 50,000 applications, say almost all of them are coming from different high schools. Say that they're coming from 30 to 40,000 different high schools. Every transcript looks different. And so institutions have moved to something called the self-reported academic record, where students are typing in information about, I took Algebra 2 in my freshman year, and I got a A-. And they're doing that for every single one of the courses. It's a huge time suck for students. And it's one of the biggest complaints that many institutions are getting right now. I think that AI can be used to be able to parcel out that data, to extract that data from a transcript, and then to make it so that institutions can recalculate GPAs in a more efficient way. That's something how I can see AI being used in the future, but no one is there yet. No one has crossed that threshold of being able to extract transcript information from a high school and use it. I will agree that admissions offices are currently looking for ways that we can use AI in the future to more systematically extract information from objective records. So the best example that I've seen is a vendor demoed a product where a student would be interacting on a chatbot, and that they would upload a college transcript, and then the college transcript would get paired with that institution's articulation tables, and the chatbot would say, here's how your courses will transfer to the institution. Again, that's matching objective information with objective decisions. I don't see how an admissions officer, regardless of size of their applicant pool, is going to be able to justify taking out the human element of reading the application, understanding the context of the student's educational setting, and replacing the decisions that happen from students, and then talking to a parent and saying, no one read your essay. We just ran it through a computer and it told us who we should admit or not. I would have a hard time explaining that to a parent that was a process. And certainly we are not there yet. And I don't see us going that direction in the future.
What you mentioned, Andy, are you in conversations with other leaders who are experimenting with that or experimenting with any aspect of AI helping in file reading?
I think that we are toying around with how do you identify generative AI in essays? What is an effective way where you could be able to identify that a particular essay was written by a human versus by ChatGPT? And one institution I talked to has found is that they ran all of their 2023 essays through a vendor that looked for what are our essays that were given assistance through ChatGPT. And about 10% of those essays flagged as receiving assistance. So the interesting part is not that 10% were flagged. It's that this institution went back and looked at their 2013 essays and ran that through the same model to identify if certain sentences or phrases were used by generative AI. And 10% of those were flagged. Well, ChatGPT didn't exist 10 years ago. So there's some error tied to identifying what was used with ChatGPT and what wasn't. There's risk in saying to a student, we think that you used generative AI to write your essay, when in fact they didn't. And unless we're able to identify with 100% accuracy who did and who didn't, then I don't think that institutions can right now effectively use AI to look through essays. One of the best ways that I've heard that ChatGPT can be used to help students write essays is as a thought partner. Same way that if a student was working with a teacher or another student, or say a paid consultant, we still expect the student to write the essay, but it can be a starting place. What does a college essay even look like? How would it respond to a particular prompt? It might generate some ideas, but it's not going to get to the student's voice of it telling an admissions officer who the student is. I think that AI will get better. It will become harder to parcel out what's generative AI and what's not. And when we cross that threshold where we're not able to really make an effective distinction between the student's voice and generative AI, I think institutions will just go to more of like what you and I are doing right now, talking over video. What's your elevator pitch? Tell me about who you are. Well, we'll see if AI catches up with that. Like, we are in the sorting business. We are trying to collect information that can effectively being able to use to assess how students are going to perform on our campus.
I'm really kind of heartened to hear sort of a little bit of the pump the brakes, proceed with caution, because on the counseling side, one thing I encounter, in fact, true story, this is someone who's already been accepted at your institution for this year. In fact, his sister's there now. But he reaches out to me and he says, this AI detector keeps saying that I used AI when I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And he was really adamant about it. And I just told him to go ahead and, submit it.
Right.
And, so I think there's a concern I have a little bit on my part if people jump too quickly to some of these new things before they've been vetted. Do you hear stories like that?
I do hear stories like that. I hear that concern from students, from counselors, from parents, from admissions officers about what if we're wrong? And until we can know for certainty that we're right, I don't think that we can go down the road of penalizing a student just because we think that they may have had assistance. The same way, if I think that an essay was written by a parent, I have to take it at face value that that's what the student submitted as their original work. They check the box that says, I attest that this information is accurate. Now it's going to end up to see how does that student perform when they're on campus. But it's a slippery slope if we start parceling out who is going to be admitted and who's not based off of who we think cheated.
So, Andy, let's talk about some other areas where AI may or may not be effective. ChatGPT's gotten all the buzz, essays have gotten all the buzz, but there's talk about some other ways in which AI may be able to help admission offices. I'll just kind of throw out an area, and I'd love to know your thoughts in terms of where we're at now and where you see, if any, potential in the future. So, and one, maybe you've already alluded to this, but administrative efficiency. Any thoughts on that?
No, I think that that's probably the main task where ChatGPT can help an admissions office. Think of the task at your job that you hate doing the most. That is just repetition of one thing after another, whatever that may be. I think that that's where AI can help. We see it with how you cash a check. Well, the format for that check is pretty consistent and the information that's consistent. There's nothing to say that we can't standardize information as it flows from a student or a high school even to an admissions office to, say, a Department of Education, to the IRS, to then provide that information back to an admissions office without retyping all of that information over and over and over again. Someone described, one of the best descriptions that I've heard of this is that high school transcripts exist electronically. And then we print them or turn them into a PDF, and then send them to a college. And then that college will then take that PDF and then translate it back to a text format. So it's like using text to voice to say, send Mark a text message. Hey, what time's our interview? And then hit send. And then you receive it. And then you say, read text message from Andy. And it says that same thing. It's kind of an inefficiency of passing information. And that's where I think AI can truly help admissions offices. But that doesn't replace the decision making or the subjective review of how we do our work.
Yeah, and I think that's clear. And we, like you said, you have to be able to understand context. And there's so many, unique idiosyncrasies that the human element, I think, is here for a long time. Anybody doing holistic admissions. What about recruitment? Do you see any potential for AI in helping it with recruitment?
there was an article that was written by a director of admissions that talked about how she was using AI to improve the efficiency of her staff and target students that maybe were just needed an extra nudge to be able to choose to enroll at that institution. I would argue that that wasn't necessarily AI as the way people might assume that it was, that it is using linear regression or logistical regression to identify the students in the ways that they're interacting with the website, or if they're opening emails, or if they visited campus, that you are able to sort students into buckets of very likely to enroll or not likely to enroll at all. But that gets back to the idea of operational efficiency, of how do you maximize staff time in a way that is using data to align with the effort of the staff. I think it's a good example of how data can be used, but I would also argue that it's not quite AI as what is the true definition.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
Friends, if you're a regular listener of our podcast, you know I'm doing something I've never done before. I'm giving you the recommended resource on a Monday instead of on a Thursday. And that's because Susie Costello, who's a regular listener of our podcast in the listening family, she sent me an email and she's like, Mark, have you seen the Dream School documentary? It's on PBS. And I was like, no, but I could just tell by her description, it was one I had to watch. So I watched it and it was riveting. And I've had several other people watch it so far, and everybody has been glad that they watched it. So all you have to do is go to YouTube, actually. It's completely free, and put in Dream School PBS, and a 56-minute documentary on the college admission process will pop up. I mean, they grapple with so many issues in that documentary, and it's so poignant, so powerful, because they trace the lives of 6 students. So they talk about legacy and major and race and geography and standardized testing. And it's a range of genders and social classes and races and people from different geographical locations all in this country. And they grapple with things like student and parent ambition and disappointment. And they interview about 6 to 8 college admission deans and VPs of enrollment in the process. And they also have Angel Perez on, who was outstanding, the president of NACAC. And he had many, many sentient comments. So I can't recommend this documentary enough. It personifies so many of the things we're attempting to convey in this podcast. Just go to YouTube and put in Dream School PBS and watch the 56-minute documentary. And I return to my interview with Andy Borst. Andy, go into a little more detail on linear and logistical regression. Explain how that works. Maybe a term that some are familiar with, and maybe a bunch of others may not be.
Sure. So it is a statistical technique to identify differences across students across multiple variables. And then you plot them across 2 axes, and then you draw a best fit line. And then you measure the distance between those different data points and that best fit line. And the closer that you can get those dots to the line, the better the model will tell you what the eventual student behavior is. Now, we are predicting the life choices of teenagers. I don't care how much data you have, you can't tell a student exactly where they're going to go to college or how they're going to get there. In fact, if I tell my son what to do something, there's a good chance that he's going to choose to do the opposite of what I instructed him to do. But those type of models help give a quantitative measure based off of a certain set of variables like test score, geography, demographic information, distance from campus, of how likely a student is to perform in certain ways once they're on campus, or whether they're going to choose to enroll. Regression can also be used to classify students into buckets. I mentioned before who's likely to enroll versus who's not likely to enroll. But there's a bunch of other stratifications that you can do using imperfect information to give an idea of how a student may land one way or the other.
So you're basically talking about predictive modeling, right?
Yes, predictive modeling, which has been around for hundreds of years.
Sure. And from your experience, what are some of the variables that are most salient when you've seen different predictive modeling models, or just what you've toyed with and experimented in your different institutions?
The best quote that I've heard about college admissions right now is that the major sorting mechanism in who goes to college and where they go to college is not admissions, it is cost. So if you say to a student that is on free and reduced lunch and that they are working a part-time job, although they're working 40 hours a week at that part-time job in order to help their family pay the bills, and they get into a prestigious institution that's going to charge them $60,000 a year, that's not access. That was great that it helped a student with admissions, but what really moves the needle on where students go to college is the price point of where they attend. There are some other metrics that I see. Most students will attend college within a 3-hour driving radius of their home. Their academic profile plays a lot, has a lot to do with where a student eventually enrolls. But the main sorting factor that I've seen that institutions can move up and down, and that students don't really have the opportunity to move up and down, is that price point.
So cost, distance from home, and academic profile. Those are three of the big ones.
Yeah, that was taught that the triangle, the iron triangle of admissions is program, place, and price. Do you have the program that the student is looking for? What is your location, either far enough away from home or too far away from home? And then price, can the student honestly afford to attend that institution?
And the profile of the student, is that just simply because the stronger student's going to have more options and therefore it becomes a more competitive situation? Or is that also related to prestige? I mean, go into depth a little bit more about why it's easier to yield a lower GPA student than a higher GPA student.
All right, so I think you just identified as that students with better academic profiles are going to have more options available to them depending on the choice set that they identified in their applicant pool. But then also the way that discount modeling is happening at certain colleges, did that student receive enough subsidy to choose to attend maybe a lower prestige institution, or do they want to pay the higher cost to attend the higher prestige institution? Now, how they define quality and prestige is up to the student, and that has very different measures depending on background, socioeconomic background, education, just general perception of the student, where their friends are going.
Yeah, I find it's highly correlated to the socioeconomic class of the family, highly, highly correlated. And that makes sense too, because the cost becomes either a non-factor, negligible, or a very big deal, because 60,000 to somebody is absolutely not doable, and to someone else it's a drop in the bucket, and then many other people it's somewhere in between. But Andy, you're absolutely right. The educational attainment of the parents is also a very big factor from my experience as well. It makes a lot of sense, most definitely. So is there anything else on this AI topic that we haven't talked about that you think a parent listening or a college counselor listening should know?
If you'll indulge me for 1 second, one part of AI that I am excited about that we are currently exploring, we are nowhere putting this into production, that we're playing around with, is we know a lot of information about students as they come through the door, what classes that they're testing into. So are they testing into college algebra? Are they testing into calculus? What AP classes they're bringing with them? I'm excited about our possibility of using that information to project out what courses we're going to need to be able to offer over the course of the next 4 years, so that students can register for the classes that they need without worrying about, is that class going to be offered that semester? And we can chart out what is the typical path, how is the curriculum designed, and then how are students in the past navigating that behavior. And then if you increase the size of the freshman class, we can still project out what courses are we going to need 4 years from now, and then make hiring decisions of faculty so that we can offer those classes. That's not necessarily college admissions, but it's, as I've stepped from my role as admissions director into enrollment, it's not just who gets in the front door, but how can we make sure that we're directing resources in a way that it's going to get students through in a timely manner.
Your big in-state rival school has something on their website I love called admission snapshots. I don't know. Have you seen what what they have
As
up
a
there with
general
that?
rule, I never look at Georgia Tech.
There you go. It's a good way to play it safe. Unless you're pummeling them on the football field, then you can tune in.
No, one of the best resources that I've seen comes from Rick Clark at Georgia Tech that talks about, he has a great blog and great guidance with his partner of Brendan Barnard about podcasts helping students to navigate the admissions process. And so I'm an avid reader of things that are produced by Rick and Georgia Tech.
I know, and you've been on there before, and Rick and Brennan have actually been on here 3 times each, so they're only
Great.
two of three-time guests, going all the way back to our first year in 2008. But I was referring specifically to, they have something on their website called Admission Snapshots, and what it does is it takes any student from a Georgia school where they've had 10 or more students in the last 4 years, and it shows what their high school GPA was at the high school, their test scores, not individually, but in the aggregate. And then they show how it translates to a Georgia Tech first year GPA.
Mm-hmm.
And in some conversations I had probably about a decade ago with a UGA admission officer, my understanding is UGA does some of that as well. I've never seen it, on a website, but I think there's a lot of potential for doing some more profiling, especially when you have large sample sizes. So you can take into consideration things like grade inflation and grade deflation. Do you see a potential for that or a use of that? And I don't know if you'd call that AI, or maybe AI could help you do it more efficiently, or maybe it's not AI, it's just statistical modeling. Tell me what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think it's a great example of transparency and an effective use of transparency. When you hear a certain GPA, and I usually hear it in the context of, I can't believe my son or daughter didn't get into your institution. They had a 3.9 GPA. And you hear that and you think, well, that student had almost all A's and maybe 1 or 2 B's. But what working in admissions and working in college counseling allows you to see is that the weighting scale for students is all over the board. A 3.9, 3.98 GPA tells me nothing about that student. I don't know what curriculum they took. I don't know what their weighting scale was for their school. I have an example that I've shown in the past of a student with a 3.98 GPA that had 4 D's and 7 C's. And they had elective courses that were weighted. They had honors driver's ed and they had honors physical education. That's
D's.
not grade inflation. That is grading scale inflation. That's not the student's fault. That's just the school that they go to. And I think the resources that Georgia Tech is producing and being transparent with that allows the student to see, I can see how my GPA is interpreted by Georgia Tech and how that translated into college performance, which is really what we're trying to get at. But I don't need to worry about what the GPA is down the block if I went to this other school. So I think it's a great example of being transparent with data that can be effective to help students make effective decision making.
Well, it also has potential to help you as a file reader too, right? If you see, I remember geeking out for 3 hours the first time I found that stuff. And I literally was studying to see who had the most grade inflation and the grade deflation. They have it for all 50 states, but the other states is just general state data. I think it's much more accurate when it's school-based. And do you hear admission officers talking about doing more of that kind of thing? Or do you think that Georgia Tech's more of a one-off on that?
I would say Georgia Tech is one of the few and the only that I'm aware of that's putting that information out for general public consumption. I think most, if not all, selective institutions have and put great effort into understanding the context of which a student is coming from. They want to understand, what is it about their high school curriculum? Did they take advantage of all of the rigor that was available to the student? What is available? None of those offices are going to penalize a student for not taking an AP class that was never offered by the school. Like, we can't ask a student to truly do the impossible, but we do want to see, what is it about their neighborhood? And I do see colleges and universities making greater efforts to understand the context of a high school setting.
Great. Well, before, Andy, we switch to our second big topic, I do want to ask you about FAFSA. You commented early on the FAFSA debacle. Do you see a lot of schools extending their deadlines to June? I know Angel Perez was out with an article in Inside Higher Ed saying he can't imagine National Candidate Reply Day remaining May 1st, given the FAFSA delays. What are your thoughts on where that's going?
I think most admissions offices are waiting to have verified information from the Department of Education. Because when we first started this, it was going to be FAFSAs available on January 1 by law. Great. Well, when will colleges and financial aid offices get that information from the Department of Ed that's been verified by the IRS? That went from early February to now it's being promised to early March. The Secretary of Education just came out and said that they're going to get test files to colleges and universities in the next 2 weeks. I need to know, when is that information in mass going to be flowing into our systems before we make a decision on if we're going to move off of the May 1 date or not. So I applaud the schools that have come out with information, but for my institution, and I think a lot of other institutions, we're waiting to deal with more certainty before we know for sure. The pressure to move May 1 right now comes from other institutions. We're not getting calls coming from students or parents about, hey, I need to know about when is my decision date. We're still trying to get our March 15th date of our regular decisions out the door, but it's something that we're watching closely.
Great. Awesome. Friends, this concludes this interview, but Andy is back for 2 more Mondays to talk about a completely different topic. But you have to tune in next week to see what we talk about. Yes, I'm leaving you with a tease. On Thursday's episode, Vince and I continue our conversation about an article that appeared in the New Yorker entitled, How Rich or Not Rich Do You Need to Be to Get in the Ivy League by Gail Cornwell. Kids whose parents make $158,200 to $222,400 a year have the worst odds of acceptance. Vince has already described the article, and Vince and I will discuss whether we agree with the article. Part 2 of 2. A question from a listener is one Susan and I answer. It comes from Amy, and she wants to know, what are 3 or 4 tips that you have for homeschool students in the college admission process? And for our interview, it'll be part 2 of 2 as Lisa continues her interview with Scott Barnhart about admissions for performing arts majors. And Scott, a former Broadway actor, will be sharing some tips for our listeners. And for our college spotlight, we have a whole new interview. Gil Villanueva, the VP of Enrollment at Rhodes College. And you will get 2 interviews on this episode, as it'll be part 1 of 2 as Gil breaks down Rhodes College. And I close by referring to that axiom I was mentioning earlier when I was talking about my weight challenge. Something I like to remind myself over and over again. It certainly applies to me in this journey, and it applies to you as well. And it's simply this: if you always do what you've always done, then you'll always get what you've always got. Another way of putting it is, if what you're doing's not working for you, time to mix it up. That could apply to anything from the college admission process to being a student to a work situation. A lot of applications there. See you on Thursday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stalianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcast. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.